You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to buckeyegrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Friday, and welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio podcast. I am your host, Kyle Lamb, here on BuckeyeGrove.com. I can say Good Friday for the first time, as the Unscripted Ohio podcast has now gone 2 days a week. From here forward, we will be doing Monday and Friday shows. So very excited, and what a great way to start the Friday edition, because we have a lot to unpack today. Kevin Noon, publisher of Buckeye Grove, will be with me here in just a second. We got a lot to talk about. He was in Chicago for Big Ten Media Days on Monday and Tuesday. We're going to get into all of that. Of course, Zach Smith being terminated by Ohio State. We'll break down what that means for the Buckeyes and recruiting. We'll also talk about that with Mark Givler later in the show. He's going to be along as we get into recruiting. What does Zach Smith's termination mean for Ohio State and for recruiting? Of course, they've named his replacement interim wide receiver coach Brian Hartline. We'll talk about that with Kevin as well. Also, in addition to the recruiting with Mark later on the show, Joel Klatt of Fox Sports will be along. He is the color commentator for Fox. Does a great job. In my mind, Joel is probably the best analyst in the business. I'm very excited to have him on the show. He's got a lot to say. He's going to tell you what he thinks of Dwayne Haskins, what he thinks Ohio State's offense is going to look like in 2018. We'll get into some Big Ten talk. What does he think of Big Ten? Is it the best conference in America? He has some very pointed words to say about that. And of course, if you paid any attention to Joel last year in the 2017 season, especially late in the year, you know his thoughts on the playoff discussion, playoff scenarios, the process, how the committee went about picking Alabama for the playoff, the Final Four. He's got some opinions that have not gone away. Let's just say, I will tease, he definitely is not shy about expressing those opinions, so we'll talk to him about that and kind of poke his cage a little bit and get him riled up. But I promise you, it's a great interview. So in addition to Kevin joining me, we've got Mark Givler later to talk recruiting, and Joel Klatt of Fox will be along. Very excited about that. One note, you basketball fans, of course, on this last Monday show, you may have heard Aaron Kraft, Andrew Dockich, and David Lighty talking about the basketball tournament as well as the status of the program under Chris Holtmann and being welcomed back as former players. Well, keep in mind, tonight, 9 p.m., you can catch the Scarlet and Gray team on ESPN against the Primetime Players. That'll be live from Atlanta. A couple roster notes. Jared Solinger will not be taking part in the action tonight. He is going to be getting married this weekend. It is not clear if he will be there Sunday if they win, because they play Sunday afternoon if they win tonight. But he will not be there tonight, and Byron Mullins has also stated on his Instagram he will also not be taking part because of some differences with how they are splitting the possible $2 million payday should they win the tournament. So Byron Mullins and Jared Solinger are out for tonight. However, Greg Oden will be on the roster and will be available to play. So you will get to see Oden dress up again for the Scarlet and Gray. That should be very exciting. So the Scarlet and Gray team live from the basketball tournament that is tonight at 9 p.m. against the Primetime Players. And I am joined today in our first Friday edition by BuckeyeGrove.com publisher Kevin Noon. And Kevin, you have been keeping very busy, burning the midnight oil all week long, and it's impressive what you and Mark have done to keep the site neat and tidy, as we have a lot to talk about this week.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, we've been busy, and fall camp is going to be starting here soon, but we just got back from Chicago and Big Ten Media Days, and obviously there's never a shortage of news with Ohio State, but I won't get ahead of myself.
But Kevin, let's start at the top, and unless somebody was living in a cave this week or they were taking a sabbatical from the internet, they know Ohio State had a tumultuous week. in terms of public perception with the stuff coming out about Zach Smith. And we don't need to talk about all the details there because I think it's been hashed and rehashed. But it obviously was big news, and we now know that Ohio State is going to turn the page, and they've already announced on Thursday that Brian Hartline will be the interim coach. Let's start with the immediate aftermath of Ohio State. What do you see coming from this change, if anything? Do you think it's going to play a big part either on or off the field in terms of production, recruiting, that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, you can't sell the fact that Zach Smith was a very dynamic recruiter, but I think Brian Hartline could do that as well. People will see that Zach Smith was recruiting the state of Florida, especially South Florida, and lo and behold, Brian Hartline used to play for the Miami Dolphins. So, I mean, he may know his way around the Miami-Dade County, Broward County area as well. So, I don't think that they lose, an area in terms of not having a guy who's familiar with it. But I think when you sit there and you look at it maybe from a development standpoint, you've got a guy in Brian Hartline who just played in the league. He had, a 7-year career. I mean, he had some pretty solid seasons. I mean, sure, he wasn't, didn't have a Hall of Fame career by any stretch of the imagination, but playing 7 years there, he knows what it takes to be successful in the NFL. I remember one year at the Ohio State Pro Day, he was out there running routes for the quarterbacks because you can't have current players doing stuff. So, I mean, he still looks like he could play, by all accounts. I think it is going to be a good move in terms of maybe just the development in terms of the receivers. They get a little bit younger in terms of bringing Hartline in, who's just 31 years old. I like the move. I think it's a good move, especially in the shadow of a bad situation.
What's interesting about this, it's not too often you get everybody I've talked to and everybody I've read and listened to has nothing but great things to say about Hartline as a potential coach here. And that's interesting because it's not too often that you get that about, like you mentioned, he's a 31-year-old and he doesn't have coaching experience. It's not too often that everybody is so in unanimous feeling about a guy like I've been reading about Hartline. And that really, I think, says a lot about his acumen, his love for the game of football, his knowledge of the game. Nobody has anything but great things to say about Hartline as he takes over as interim wide receivers coach.
Right, and remember, he's been with the program for a couple years in a quality control role, so it's not like he's walking into a room and he has to make sure that the receivers are wearing name tags to know who they are, putting tape on their helmets so he knows who they are. He knows these guys. He's worked with these guys. I mean, sure, there are limitations on what a QC guy can do versus what a position coach can do, but I think it'll be a quick study, and yeah, he does have the interim title this year. He has, this year to kind of show Urban Meyer and the offensive staff that he has what it takes to be a permanent coach. And I think good things will come. And it's obviously a good situation too, having Dwayne Haskins, a quarterback who's very dynamic in terms of the passing game. Yeah, we haven't had a chance to see a lot of it. We saw him in very limited action last season, but by everything we've seen so far, I mean, it should be a pretty good marriage.
It will be interesting for me to see how he embraces the recruiting, because as we know from Urban Meyer, one of the things that you absolutely must do to stay on staff and be a successful coach under Urban Meyer is you've got to go out and recruit, and it'll be interesting to see what kind of results he does getting out into the recruiting process and getting to establish relationships and sell Ohio State from that perspective.
Well, and I think Mark will be able to touch on this more when you have him on the show later. But yeah, it's not like Brian Hartline has not been involved in the recruiting process. Just because he can't go on the road up until now, once he is elevated to this interim wide receiver coaching position, he's still on campus when kids come on campus. He still talks to the kids, and I've already heard stories about recruits really liking Brian Hartline. So I don't think we're going to see any sort of just gigantic downturn. I mean, he's going to have to learn, just maybe the finer points. The NC2A does not make the recruiting trail easy. I mean, there's a lot of study that has to go into place for a young coach who's just jumping into that type of position. But I believe Brian Hartline will be able to pick that all up pretty quickly. And Ohio State has a very good recruiting department spearheaded by Mark Pantoni. I think they're going to put him in a position to be very successful. Yeah,
and that's a great point. I want to bring that up real quick, too. For people that aren't aware of how the recruiting works, like a guy like Brian Hartline as quality control coach was not allowed to go out and recruit. He was not to make phone calls, but he was allowed allowed to have interactions on official and unofficial visits on campus, and that's kind of similar to the role that Ohio State basketball has Scooney Penn in now. He's not allowed to recruit off campus, but when it comes to hosting recruits and everything, he is allowed to get his hands dirty. So that is something Hartline does already have a little bit of experience from that standpoint. So it's not going to be a complete and total transition, but yeah, like you mentioned, we'll definitely get into the specifics of that, how that'll work going forward with Mark Gibler. So Kevin, of course, everybody that wasn't talking about Zach Smith this week in Chicago, of course, the other big thing to ask about is the quarterback situation. I thought it was interesting. Urban, I don't want to say he backtracked a little bit, but he definitely left the door open when asked about Haskins being the starter. And I think we all know when push comes to shove, he will be starting. I don't think there's any question about that, regardless of what Urban says or doesn't say. But it was interesting. He came off his, Haskins as a starter thing just a little bit. Do you read anything into that, or do you think that it's just a motivation ploy on behalf, on keeping Haskins, motivated as he goes into fall camp?
I don't think it's just a matter of keeping Haskins motivated. I think it's a matter of keeping Tate Martell motivated as well, too. If you go in, you're like, well, I already know that I can't win this battle. And then I'm not saying that, specifically for Tate Martell, just human nature. If you know that you're not really going to have the opportunity to get to that top prize, are you really going to go as hard? So I think, Urban Meyer is a master psychologist in terms of knowing how to push the right buttons and get the most out of his players. It's always been a very fascinating study. I know a lot of writers have been around and looked at just the way he does that. Look at the entire black stripe process. There are players that lose theirs very early. They're the ones that maybe you need to bring along and just keep them happy. There's some that play better when they're pissed off. You leave the black stripe on them later. I know I'm really jumping off on a tangent here, but I think that Urban Meyer knows that Dwayne Haskins is going to be the starter, but he also knows that Tate Martell is going to have to play some too, and they're going to have to play Tate Martell to keep him engaged, and he's a twisted ankle or a sore shoulder away from being out there. There's not a lot of depth in that quarterback room. So, it's going to take a lot of work from Urban Meyer and Ryan Day and Kevin Wilson, the offensive staff, to find the sweet spot in terms of making sure everybody's getting the right reps. You're not dealing with players with a ton of experience on the collegiate level. With Martell, it's zero experience on the collegiate level. And, just saying the right things. Plus, too, let's be real. The Big Ten Media Days is kind of a dog and pony show, and they're just, they're feeding the media red meat out there, but, they know what they're doing.
Yeah, and I guess if you're the Ohio State coaches, you've got to hold your breath especially hard right now, just because, after Martell, your number 3 quarterback is Matthew Baldwin, who is still recovering from that ACL injury, and it sounds like he's still a ways away from being available. That right now he's not full go. So, did he give any kind of timetable when they expect Baldwin to be back in the fray completely?
I just would not expect him to be in the fray at all this season. They said he's up 20 pounds. Talked to Paris Campbell. He said that he can sling it and that he's going to be elite. Those are all the things you would expect to hear. But if, I knock on wood, I don't want it to come across sounding weird on the podcast, but knocking on wood quietly, you don't want to get into a third quarterback situation, and if you do, it's not going to be Matthew Baldwin at this point. I'm really not sure. They have a couple walk-ons. You could probably put somebody back there in a wildcat situation, but all of these special things we're talking about that could be in store for this team will probably be taken off the table if they lose both of their quarterbacks. So, Matthew Baldwin will be there for the 1920 season, and that's where I think everybody should really kind of focus.
So Draymond Jones already, fueling up the hype train for the defensive line this year, saying he expects to have the best defensive line in the country. And of course, you expect a guy in his position to say something like that. And I think it's interesting because I'm really looking forward to watching this defensive line and also kind of contrasting it with Clemson's, because at least from my perspective, and there might be some people out there that remember some better instances, but I don't remember having 2 potentially dominant defensive lines in the same season as we could see with these two units. Maybe since the Florida State line of the 90s. They're both potentially really, really good, and they both have their pluses and minuses. Clemson, I think, is probably a better starting group on paper. Ohio State maybe getting a little bit more depth, especially inside. But I'm sure, Kevin, you're very anxious to see. You'll get to see Ohio State, maybe not Clemson as much, but very anxious to see these units grow this year.
Right. I mean, you lose three talented defensive ends who go to the NFL, and you're talking about this year's line potentially being better. And that is the combination of, I think they're going to be better inside. Draymond Jones is going to be a year older. I mean, he already looks the part. I mean, if I mean, even if he's just the same player he was last year, which he'll be better this year. I mean, he's already very, very dominating at this point. You get Nick Bosa and Chase Young and Jonathan Cooper. You get a smaller rotation at the end position. They're going to get more snaps out there. I mean, I think that so much was made of when you had Tyquan Lewis and Sam Hubbard and Jalen Holmes of, well, we're keeping them fresh. Well, you just had to keep everybody happy too at that point. And maybe they weren't getting enough snaps, but who do you keep off the field at this point? And then the depth with the young incoming defensive tackles with Tommy Togiai, and then once Teron Vincent and Antoine Jackson are healthy, and you can't forget guys like B.B. Landers and Devon Hamilton. I mean, they just have just a lot of riches on that defensive line, and as long injuries are always going to be the great equalizer, but I think that this line really could be a special one. And as for the Clemson line, yeah, it's kind of been ridiculous, just what they've had and just their ability to keep reloading guys there, and a lot of guys that could have left to go to the draft this year decided to come back for another year, which just makes them that much scarier. So, I mean, they're going to be getting a lot of headlines too.
Yeah, that was interesting because they had, I think, out of their four starters, I think 3 of them were draft eligible, and 2 of them seemed to be like probably first or second round picks, and they had every single one of them come back, which is just remarkable, especially in this day and age. So it's going to be interesting to watch those 2 groups. As far as Ohio State, so we know we've talked some in the past about the defensive backfield. The linebackers I want to touch on going into camp. Who are you targeting as the starting linebackers and the guys that you think are going to step up for Ohio State?
Well, I think you're going to need to see Baron Browning play the Mike position. I don't necessarily think that's the position he needs to be in, but he needs to be on the field, and somebody's going to have to play the Mike. So for the time being, I think that's where you're going to put Baron Browning, and then with your Sam and Will, I think you're going to see Keandre Jones and Malik Harrison, and I think you definitely see some of the younger guys pushing, and by the younger guys, put like Pete Werner in that category. I mean, you got an old veteran like Dante Booker who maybe slowed a touch at the start of camp, but he's going to be there. You just don't know. I mean, you look at guys like Johnny Dixon who missed a lot of time and then only to come in and have a pretty solid year toward the end of his career. Can Dante Booker step into that role? I don't know, but the incoming freshman class is going to be very strong too. And then of course there's the question of when is Tuf Borland going to be back? He is a Mike linebacker. That is where he is the best. That's where he needs to be at. He's coming off of this Achilles injury. Nobody's calling it a tear. There's, everybody's been very vague with a lot of details on it, but Urban Meyer said in Chicago that he expects him back for the season, and what does that mean? The first game of the season? No, there's no way he'll be back by that point, in my opinion. Does that mean maybe after the non-conference part of the schedule, in time for maybe Penn State or right after Penn State? I don't know. I mean, I've heard November, but Tuf Borland, he's categorized him there with like JT Barrett in terms of coming back after that procedure post Michigan to play in the Big Ten championship game. Could we see him sooner than later? I don't know, but he's missed a lot of time. It's going to take him some time to get the ring rust off as well. But, I think when you sit there and you look at the starting backers, I have Keandre Jones, Baron Browning, and Malik Harrison as the 3 backers who will emerge coming out of fall camp.
So one last question here as we get ready to go into fall camp next week. Football is just around the corner. Before we know it, it's going to be September 1st, and Ohio State will be kicking things off against Oregon State. So as far as the young players, the freshmen or maybe redshirt freshmen, who are the guys that you're most interested to see that will probably figure into at least the rotation here in 2018?
Well, and let's also remember, too, with the new redshirting rule, I mean, we could see everybody because of the fact that you can play 4 games without losing that redshirt season. But, I think when we look at guys, I think that Jeremy Ruckert at tight end is going to be somebody who will be very much in the mix. Urban Meyer said he's going to play all 4 tight ends this year, which is Ruckert, Luke Farrell, Jake Hausman, and Rashad Berry. I really am curious to see true freshman Jalen Gill at H. I mean, especially if DeMario McCall still has a hard time putting the ball away safely. I mean, I think we could see Jalen Gill get in there and have an opportunity. Nick Petit-Frere at offensive line. I mean, obviously, you don't want to get to the point where you're having to move guys in and out of the offensive line. They need to play as a unit, but he's good enough to potentially be out there very early in his career. Moving on the defensive side of the ball, I know I'm getting long-winded here. I think Tyreek Smith could be the fourth defensive end, could be there with Jonathan Cooper as the twos on the end position. I've already kind of talked about Tommy Togiai, defensive tackle. I think he is going to be seeing some significant playing time. And looking at a couple of defensive backs, you got redshirt corner Sean Wade. I think he's somebody who could get into the mix. He was hurt. He would have played as a true freshman if he wasn't hurt. And then I think you also have to look at Josh Proctor coming out of Oklahoma, true freshman safety. I think he's somebody who is going to be special. You need to play him as soon as you can.
Kevin Noon, ladies and gentlemen, he is an encyclopedia of football knowledge, and if you want to try your wits against him, Rivals will have some fantasy football leagues coming up where you can join in. Check BuckeyeGrove.com for details on that. So if you think you can best Kevin Noon in fantasy football and on the college level, I invite you to try.
College fantasy football is coming out. It's here. We have leagues already here on Buckeye Grove. I've been playing it since the late '90s, so this is kind of my jam. So I'm pretty excited as my text messages are going off like crazy. People know when I'm on the podcast. Apparently, come on board. We're very excited about it. It's year one. It's all of Power 5 this year. Hopefully, if we get a good response this year, they'll open it up to all of Division 1A. It's going to be a lot of fun, and Yahoo has always done a great job of putting fantasy sports out there. And I promise I won't draft too many Buckeyes, so everybody can kind of spread the love a little bit. But it's gonna be a good time. We're all working on trying to get Kyle to sign up right now.
Yeah, I'll probably try my hand at that. I can't make any promises that I'm going to win leagues, but I'll give it my best. We'll see. So, well, Kevin, like I said, you guys did a bang-up job in Chicago, and all the drama that has surrounded since. You've been on top of it every step of the way. Thank you for everything you do, and we will definitely talk with you very, very soon as we're getting ready to jump full bore into football season.
Absolutely.
It's time to go inside Ohio State recruiting and take a peek behind the scenes with Buckeye Grove recruiting guru Mark Gibler and his magical orb of wonderment. They said it couldn't be done, but he's outdone himself once more. Back for another recruiting roundup.
That's what I do. I drink and I know things.
All right, Mark is joining us now, and we're going to dive right into some recruiting. Mark, you've had a busy week getting back from Chicago and then dealing with all the fallout and then getting right in and having a commitment to cover, and it just never stops for you, does it?
Yeah, it's been super busy here. Basically, leading right up to my little vacation I took, and then I get back and they kind of got thrown right back into the fire. So, and it doesn't look like it is going to slow down. I mean, this is a pretty big weekend coming up, and then some potential August decisions as well coming up. Some of those are kind of up in the air right now, but definitely a lot going on. I would say, especially given the fact that Friday Night Lights was in June and not the end of July this year, probably a lot more going on than I expected maybe 6 months ago. This would have been a kind of a dead time, I would have thought, but not the case.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that myself earlier this week, because actually, usually in July, like right before football starts, the kids that are, you would generally think the kids that are already going to decide and get their visits done, they would have done it early in the summer, and this would be a quiet recruiting time, but it actually seemed a little more active than most years.
Right, and then, on top of that, I mean, you have, the coaches are on vacation for a good chunk of July, but they were still getting commitments while they were on vacation. It was something else.
I wish I could get that kind of production when I'm on vacation.
Right. Yeah. I did nothing on vacation, so yeah. So I recharged the batteries, but Greg Schiano went out and got Luke Whippler, so that's why he's there and I'm here, I guess.
Well, so let's start off with the obvious. the big question a lot of people are curious about, the dismissal of Zach Smith this past week, and now Brian Hartline replacing him as interim wide receivers coach. People are curious, especially how this is going to impact recruiting, because, I know there are questions as to whether or not Zach Smith is believed to be a good developer of talent wide receiver, but I think most people will agree he is a good recruiter. So there is a lot of questions, how will this affect recruiting, and will it affect recruiting at all? And how do you see Brian Hartline jumping in as a recruiter?
Yeah, there's kind of a lot to unpack there. I think the first thing is that, Brian Hartline did not come out of nowhere here. He has been a guy that has really impressed people with his work ethic and the way he's gone about his business as a quality control guy. And this was almost inevitable in the sense of they were hoping that there would be a spot on the 10 on-field coaching staff for Brian at some point. Obviously, it's unfortunate how this all played out and happened, but this was probably going to be the end game regardless. At some point in the next 12 months, if they had to replace a coach for whatever reason, that they were going to try to elevate Hartline into some type of on-field role, and it just so happened that you're going to get the natural fit there of wide receiver. So there's that. Then there's Zach's impact on 2019. I mean, like I said on our message board this week, he's a polarizing guy, I think, in the fan base. He certainly had his detractors among the fan base, but he could recruit. Not only could he recruit, he was thrown into some very tough areas, South Florida. He's had experience in Georgia and, Virginia Beach area. I mean, these are not easy areas to recruit. These are typically where your national battles occur. So there is, this was not one of those situations, they're losing something here. I mean, we can argue all day about development and a million different things about his Twitter and things like that. But at the end of the day, one of the very best recruiters on the staff. But moving from there, here's where it gets interesting. Within I think people overlook this a little bit. Within the coaching staff and within the walls over there at the Woody, you're going to have differing opinions on different players. So when Zach is the receivers coach, his voice is pretty big when it comes to who they're going to really target, who they're going after. Obviously Urban Meyer gets final say over everybody, but that's a big voice to remove from the discussion in terms of the wide receiver board and all that goes with that. So now it's a matter of who has the voice now. Does Brian Hartline have the voice? He's been in the program. I'm sure he's done a lot of film study on some of these guys. Is he the top voice? Is a guy like Ryan Day the top voice? I've been told by several people that Ryan Day likes Elijah Higgins more than maybe some of the other guys over there, including Zach, did. So now you've got that dynamic of, okay, is this good news for Elijah Higgins? I think it might be. How does this impact a guy like Jamison Williams, who I believe is pretty high on the board with just about everybody over there, but you still have that dynamic where Zach Smith was the primary recruiter of the St. Louis area as well as the receivers coach, so that's got to play out a little bit. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, and we have to kind of see how this goes in terms of who is getting final say right now. Because it doesn't look like they're just going to go on business as usual. It looks like, whether it is Brian Hartline, whether it is Ryan Day, that some of these other guys who may now have a bigger voice in who the primary targets are.
Yeah, and the receiver board is interesting because they have so many guys that they're after, so many guys that they've been in on. So as you said, you take one guy out of the mix in that coaching room, it can definitely change the complexion of what we see going forward. And I'm glad you mentioned Higgins because there are two guys I wanted to ask you about. Let's stick with Higgins for a second. He's been kind of all over the place as far as, you look around and see which schools are linked with him. There was some Stanford momentum back in the spring. There was some Florida momentum there for parts of the summer. And now, there are some that believe Ohio State may be trending well with him. What do you believe is going on with Higgins right now? Where do you see his recruitment trending at the moment?
My stance has mostly been that if Ohio State recruits Elijah Higgins with the same intensity that they recruited a guy like Garrett Wilson, that they're going to get Elijah Higgins. That's kind of been my stance. There's no question that Florida is in a better spot today than it was, a couple months ago when it looked like it was clearly Ohio State and Stanford. Now I think it's more of a trio there. And it kind of depends. Yeah, I've had people tell me they think Florida is Ohio State's biggest competition. I've had people tell me it's still Stanford. I tend to think it's Florida, just because I think he had a really good visit there when he was there not too long ago. But I think if they can reorganize here structurally with the staff and really make some clear-cut decisions and make that push, that I think they will get him. But whether they do that or what direction they go, I think they're still trying to figure that out. I think they've reached out to all the A, B, and C targets and tried to keep everybody warm for now until they can kind of sort this thing out. But like I said, I've always liked their chances with Higgins, assuming that they can, that they did it the right way, I guess.
And the other receiver, Ohio State was doing really well with, or it was believed they were doing really well with Marcus Washington, the 6'2" receiver out of St. Louis. And now it seems momentum has completely changed in that recruitment, and now a lot of people believe he's heading to Missouri. What do you know about this, or what can you share about this? And is this fallout from the Smith situation, or is this something entirely different?
I think there's a middle ground here, not to play both sides of it, but there's no question if you go back 6 weeks, maybe even less than that Ohio State was in the driver's seat, and Missouri has done a good job pushing. I mean, even before the Smith stuff came out, they were right there as number 2, and they were really making a good case to Marcus on why he should stay home. And so I think the ball started to get rolling at least a little bit for Missouri before the Smith thing. But to me, this kind of was the nail in the coffin, especially, like I said, we talked about it with Jamison Williams a little bit, who I don't think this will affect quite as much. But with Zach being the primary recruiter for the area and also the receivers coach, I think that, really shook things up. And when he stuck to this, I'm going to decide on August 7th type of stuff, that was a good thing for Missouri. I think, if he sticks with that date, that's where I think he's going. And it's just a matter of, will he stick with that date, or will he just take a step back and say, well, maybe I should rethink this, and maybe I should just kind of reshuffle the deck and see how things develop. But assuming he goes through with it on the 7th, and I think he is, I think it's going to be Missouri. And, I had a few different people I reached out to this week that had previously kind of been framing it as Ohio State's the team to beat, Missouri's pushing, and they kind of 180'd on me and said it's Missouri. So it's looking like Ohio State is out if there's a decision here in the next, week and a half, I guess.
Well, not all news is bad for Ohio State heading into the weekend. The Washington situation aside, it's a big recruiting weekend. Who'd have thought we'd be saying that, as we mentioned earlier? Who thought we'd be saying that at the end of July? But big recruiting weekend for Ohio State. That monster 2020 class that we've talked so much about, they have 4 really good prospects coming on campus. Actually, more than that, but 4 especially huge targets. Of course, they've got 4 kids from D.C., St. John's College, Mikael Sherman, Rakeem Jarrett, 2 of the preeminent players in the country that are going to be there along with a couple teammates. And then they've got Rashawn Williams, receiver out of Detroit, and Elias Ricks, the corner out of Santa Ana. What can you tell us about the kids that are coming on campus here this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of throw a blanket over, kind of make a blanket statement about the weekend, I would say this is a setting the table type of weekend. Anytime, any visit can lead to a commitment, but I'm not necessarily expecting it. I mean, you never know what can happen, especially, if a guy, I would point to a guy like Trey Williams out of St. John's, the four-star defensive tackle. Grew up a huge Ohio State fan, very enamored with the program, very enamored with Larry Johnson. This will be his first look at the school. I mean, maybe someone like that could get caught up in it. But for me, this is a setting the table weekend of these are 4 or 5 or 6 very big targets, and it's a golden opportunity to either jump out in front and really establish yourself as the team to beat, or to at least, for a guy like Mikael Sherman, who is going to be recruited by everybody, at least keep you in that top tier, which I believe Ohio State is with him. I think he's very interested in Ohio State.
And we had a commitment here this week in that 2020 class. Darvon Hubbard, the running back, now lives out in Arizona, originally from Central Ohio. What can you tell about his game, and how do you like him as a prospect?
Yeah, so he was actually at Akron Buchtel as a freshman, and moved with his family to Arizona before his sophomore season. Statistically had a better freshman year than sophomore year. A lot of that is he was the man at Buchtel, goes out to Scottsdale. He's splitting carries. He's playing with Jack Miller, so they're going to throw the ball quite a bit. And, only had about 70 carries as a sophomore. But I've seen him play. I've seen him in camps. And he reminds me, I don't know if I'm a huge full disclosure, I'm a huge Brian Snead guy, okay? So when I say this, I say this I mean this as a positive. To me, he's a little he's like Brian Snead light to me right now. But with 2 years to go in high school, I mean, he's got plenty of time to improve. But to me, that's the type of back he is. He's a big, kind of a low center of gravity, but can really get out in the open and pull away if he needs to. Has some quickness to him that maybe you wouldn't expect when you first look at him, given how strong he is. Can catch the ball a little bit out of the backfield, and I'm sure will only continue to add to that playing with Jack. So I like him. I compare him a little bit to Snead. Snead's a guy I am super, super high on, so I put him maybe just a hair below Snead at about the same point in their development, but definitely a guy who fits the system. This power spread, you kind of one cut and get upfield and have 220 pounds behind you to move the pile if necessary, and that's kind of what he is.
I apologize for those listening. I said Central Ohio. I'm not geographically challenged. I said Central Ohio, and I'm like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. But yeah, he is Northeast Ohio, not Central Ohio. So, I want to ask you, before we put a bow on this segment here and wrap things up, this 2020 class, there's, so much been talked about how, it's got a chance to be like one of the truly great classes Ohio State has ever had. It's not uncommon to see guys recruit other players. That's really, that happens in every class to some degree. But have you ever seen a class that has just really grabbed a hold of the momentum so early in the process where you get guys aggressively recruiting this soon with one another? It just seems, it's not that we haven't seen this before, but it's really taking off to a level I don't think I've ever seen it.
I think that this has definitely gone kind of next level. I'm going to scare some people when I say this probably, but 2018 was a little bit similar in terms of how they got off, to that great early start. And it was a great class on signing day too, don't get me wrong, but they got some guys early. Emory Jones and Jaden Woodby did not end up in the class. And those guys were aggressive. But this feels a little bit different. There's more. I mean, you've already got like 5 guys really into this. And even when you look back at 18, I mean, the Emory Jones thing got crazy at the end, but you kind of knew the whole way that Jaden Woodby was going to be an issue. I mean, you just knew that they were going to have to continue to recruit him. So it's kind of hard to be the leader of the class when you're also kind of, looking out the corner of your eye at other schools. And I don't get the sense that that's happening at all here. I think all the guys who decided early have been, at least to this point, have shown no signs of playing the game. You got Paris Johnson driving up here today, actually, and I believe is going to stay a little bit and sort of hang out with some of the guys that are visiting from out of state. So, I mean, just a lot of effort being put into this, and then a guy like Jake Ray, who is sort of playing quarterback, not to take away from Jack Miller, but this whole thing has kind of been brought together by Jake, and he's been very thoughtful in how they kind of go about their business, and it's like a more solid, well organized version of what we saw early in 2018, which even with some of the chaos and was still a phenomenal recruiting class. So yeah, I mean, this sky's kind of the limit here for 2020. I mean, we'll see. There's a long way to go. You got to kind of temper expectations just a little bit, just because it is so early. And as I always say, kind of big boy recruiting. We are like 14 months away from big boy recruiting starting in 2020. I mean, I don't know that Dabo and Nick Saban and Urban Meyer even look at their commitment list until October of the kids' senior season. So there's a lot of stuff here that can play out, but it's as good of a start as I can remember. I think they have all the right pieces here in terms of the talent level and the commitment to the program and the desire to do this, because this isn't for everybody. I mean, you hope you get 2 or 3 guys in a class that will do this. They've already got like 5, so it's something.
It really will be fun to watch. You can catch Mark Gibler, of course, on BuckeyeGrove.com. Read his work every day. Covers recruiting like no other. Catch him on Twitter at MarkGiblerBG for Buckeye Grove. Also, one little note I wanted to throw in here before we wrapped up. Recruit Nicks, you'll be excited to know, as Mark shared on the Horseshoe Lounge on Buckeye Grove, Rivals is coming up with a forecast system, so you will be able to read people like Mark making their educated guesses as to where recruits will be landing. The interesting thing about that feature here coming up in the next couple weeks is that users, you will also be able to make your educated or uneducated guesses, whatever the case may be. You'll be able to pick where you think recruits will be going. So that'll be a really neat feature, and I'm sure that'll really take off for the Rivals Network. Mark, I appreciate you taking the time to join us, and great stuff as always, and we'll be sure to catch up with you again soon.
Okay, thanks, man. Have a good one.
Stretch runtime here at Unscripted Ohio. Kick up your feet as we cross the finish line with the Buckeye Beat, the latest in Ohio State news and notes.
Kick the tires and light the fires, Big Daddy.
All right, I'm joined now by Fox Sports analyst Joel Klatt. Joel, I appreciate you coming to us from Chicago. I hope your trip there has been wonderful so far.
It's been good, man. It's like the unofficial end to summer and the kickoff to the college football season, so that's always a good thing. And
you're going when the wind is not bitterly cold, right? So that
helps
a little
exactly. Anytime you can be here and it's not the winter time, it's a win.
It definitely is. So Joe, I want to get right into it, talking about, let's start with Ohio State. Obviously, the big news in Columbus going into the season is Dwayne Haskins being the starting quarterback. Now, you got to see him a couple times last year. I'm curious your impressions of Haskins and what your expectations are for him as the starting quarterback of Ohio State in 2018.
Yeah, my expectations are elevated because I saw him walk into what is arguably the biggest, stage in college football, which is the Ohio State-Michigan game, down on the road and play lights out. If you can do that, you can really do anything. I would also suggest that version of Ohio State has a chance, at least, to be even more potential and lethal than they have been previously. Namely because when they lean on their running game in the interior and then they're able to throw the football down the field, it creates more levels in the defense. You basically get the second and third level out of the box. And at times, in particular in crucial situations, teams could load up the box last year, knowing that, the run was the most likely play. You could not do that with Dwayne Haskins. So my expectations are high. I think Dwayne's a heck of a player, and there's no reason to believe why he couldn't be a quarterback of a Big Ten champion team and potentially in the playoff as well.
there's never been obviously a question of his talent, his arm strength especially, but it seems like the big surprise, I think, was how he handled it in terms of poise and confidence, and he really just did not seem rattled by the moment. Was that your take as well, being there, seeing that game?
No question. But here's the thing about playing that position specifically. You can get all the mop-up duty that you want, but the fact is that there's really no other position in sports that is that difficult to translate. It's that difficult to project because of the fact that you don't know until you know. Right? Like there's no way you can duplicate the pressure. There's no way you can duplicate the speed of the real grind of college football or football in general for a quarterback. They don't get hit in practice and mop up duty. They're just kind of running the football, and the speed of the game is not quite the same. The crowd noise is certainly not quite the same. So while you think you know what a kid's personality is and how he'll react when the lights are the brightest, you don't know until you know. And so that was really the first moment that you got to look out there and say, okay, does this kid have it? And he certainly did. Again, down against Michigan, against one of the better defenses in the country. And he went out there and made some incredible plays, some incredible throws. He made some very good quality decisions. And I thought that performance in the second half in Ann Arbor should give Ohio State fans more hope than maybe anything going into this season.
I'm curious how you see the Ohio State offense evolving. I think there was some belief that maybe sometimes with JT Barrett's precision in running the spread option, that maybe it was used as a crutch at times, but they won't have that ability this year. So do you see Ohio State going into the season having the faith and trust at Haskins at using his abilities and throwing the ball downfield, or do you think they'll find other ways to ease him into the action?
Well, I think that is where the question of the season lies, is what will the offense look like? It's my belief that if you employ a game plan that is similar to the second half of the Michigan game and very similar to the national championship run of a few years ago, that's the version that would be the most dynamic, which is featuring the downhill run game, featuring J.K. Dobbins, making sure he gets more carries than the quarterback, throwing the football down the field a little bit more than they're accustomed to in the past, which is certainly what Cardale Jones did, and certainly what this team can do with a really good, talented, deep core of wide receivers that are experienced, strong-armed quarterback. I think that's where the offense will evolve to, and ultimately that's what will be the most effective. That's what the personnel dictates, and we'll see if that's what ultimately comes to fruition on the field.
I want to ask you about at least on paper, a fairly loaded Big Ten, especially on the eastern side of things this year. But in the West, it was interesting because at Media Days today, Jim Delaney made a comment, that they were not looking to change the division structure and they wanted to keep it like it is, and they weren't concerned with competitive balance. And I think he kind of hinted that things were kind of cyclical anyway, so that maybe they didn't have enough data. And I'm curious, with the emergence of Purdue coming on strong in the West and Scott Frost being at Nebraska, do you think that the balance will be there in a couple years a little bit more than maybe we're seeing now?
We'll see. I think that the cyclical nature comes generally in the strength of coaches. That's, when the SEC was at its peak, they had quality coaches up and down the board. I think that league has been poached now to the point where they're not quite as strong at the head coaching ranks. I think the strongest conference as it relates to head coaches is now the Big Ten. Now, as it relates to the structure of leagues, I'm personally of the belief that no league should have divisions, and every single league, regardless of number of teams, should have essentially a round-robin type of schedule. I know you can't do that with a 14-team league, but you can have some version of that, in particular by playing some version of a first place, second place, third place, fourth place schedule. And you try to weight it based on where teams finished the previous season. So that's where maybe I would differ from the thoughts and opinions of Mr. Delaney, but he has certainly done a remarkable job of leading this conference into what I would consider the modern age of rights deals in college football. But the competitive nature of scheduling and more specifically the inequality of schedules across college football and within conferences is something that I think needs to be changed and fixed. And an easy way to do that, at least to some degree, is by eliminating divisions altogether and playing more of a round-robin style of schedule.
Yeah, that's a segue. I guess I want to ask you about a couple teams in the East, but actually that's a good segue to something I wanted to ask you about, because you were kind of critical of not so much the selection of Alabama, but the process in which Alabama was selected. And so I'm curious what your opinion is on what they can do or maybe should do to improve the selection process, to make it more equitable and keep everybody on a level playing field.
Yeah, well, that's very hard to do. I don't think that you can improve the selection process without improving the process of college football, the structure of college football. First and foremost, I think that college football desperately needs a commissioner. Now, whether we'll get that or not, I'm not sure. But an overarching governing body over the sport is desperately needed right now, and it would help fix a lot of issues. And one of those being the schedule iniquities that we see across the sport, both within conferences and across conferences. Now, that being said, the specific structure, I guess, or selection process that you referred to is that I thought that the committee did something outside of what it was intended to do. When that process was created, what they were intended to do was reward the conference championships, in particular when you had a comparison of like resumes. Well, they told us in the weeks previous that Ohio State and Alabama's resume was comparable, if not similar, and that certainly was borne out throughout any of the analytics and data that you would look at. And then all of a sudden, Alabama was rewarded for not winning their division, for not playing a conference championship game. And Ohio State was not rewarded for beating an undefeated Wisconsin. So they went against what they were intended to do. It's my belief that you need to increase the number of committees, because right now, with only 13 variables into an equation, what you have is a high degree of statistical variance that is placed upon each variable. If you have one more influential voice, one more rogue vote, it's going to change the outcome of that variable tremendously. All you have to do is create a second and third committee. You average out the polls, and now all of a sudden you have a much better poll system and ranking system. After that, I would require that you win your conference championship in order to go to the playoff. That's why I argued for Penn State 2 years ago over Ohio State. That's why I argued for Ohio State over Alabama. The fact that we're rewarding teams for not winning their division and not winning their conferences is not good for college football in the long run. And the committee needs to take a hard look at what precedent they have set and what precedent they are setting for the future in regards to non-conference scheduling, Power 5 scheduling, because right now they're not rewarding teams for doing what they thought they were going to do at the initial outset of this committee and this playoff.
One last question I have on the playoff angle. Jim Harbaugh said today, he would do away with conference championships and go to 8 or 16, or maybe 8 and eventually 16. Do you agree with where he's coming from, or is that maybe a little bit further beyond what you're saying?
Yeah, I totally disagree with that. I think that the number of playoff teams right now is absolutely correct. If you keep the number of playoff participants at one less or less than the number of power conferences in the country, then you retain the unique nature and the important nature of the regular season. It's the most unique and most important regular season in all of sport that must be maintained. It's the nature and fabric of college football. It's why it's such a great sport. Therefore, if you grow this playoff, you're essentially stealing the quality of the regular season in order to try to manufacture some quality at the back end of the season. That's the exact wrong way to go. So growing it to 8 or 16 is not right. You're just going to move the discussion from 9 to 8, from 17 to 16. That's not going to help anybody. That's not going to solve anything. It's very easy to fix this entire process. And again, a commissioner could do this on day one. All you have to do is get rid of all divisions in college football. Everybody plays a round-robin schedule. Everyone has to play a conference championship game. At that point, those conference championship games are essentially quarterfinal games, and yet you would still leave out one of the 5 champions and a group of 5 champion and take the 4 best of those teams rather than just the 4 best period of this larger number of teams that may or may not have won their conference championship. That way we retain the importance and unique nature of the regular season, retain the value and importance of those conference championship games. In fact, you increase them. They become de facto quarterfinal games. And then you increase the number of committees. You get that right. And all of a sudden you've got a playoff system that has very little flaws in it versus what we have now, which is some major flaws because of the nature of non-champions and one committee.
As we wrap up with Joel Klatt of Fox Sports, Joel, one last question. So the Big Ten East on paper, it would seem as strong coming into the season as maybe it's ever been. You've got Ohio State, a top 3, top 5 team. Penn State, top 5, top 10. Michigan top 10. Michigan State maybe top 10, top 15. Legitimately, it seems like all 4 of those are definitely Big Ten East contenders, if not maybe national title contenders.
No question. No question. I think it's probably, well, not even probably. This conference, if you include Wisconsin, this conference with 5 teams in the top, 10, 11, 12, is by far the deepest and best conference of college football this year, hands down. It's really no argument. And anyone that tries to argue it is asinine, quite frankly. The champion of this league is going to be easily one of the best teams and most deserving teams in college football. There's no question about that. This would be like having Washington, Oklahoma, Georgia, Auburn, and Clemson all in one conference. It'd be unheard of, right? I mean, it'd be crazy. That's essentially what the Big Ten has right now with these 5 teams. And in the East Division, I guess the biggest question is can somebody come out of this with one or fewer than 2 losses? It's going to be very difficult, very difficult. Let's hope that the committee does the right thing and honors the path of most resistance rather than the path of least resistance, which right now is the schedule like the SEC.
Joe, I said when the availability came out, I want that guy because, he, for better or worse, he calls it like he sees it, and he doesn't mince words, and you didn't disappoint, so I appreciate that, and it was a pleasure to get to talk to you about this.
You bet. Thanks for standing by my long-winded answers.
Well, thanks for coming on, Joel. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, bud.
That's a wrap for today's Unscripted Ohio podcast. Thank you for giving us a listen. A reminder, you can catch us Monday and Friday on BuckeyeGrove.com as well as on the archives, Google Play, iTunes, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. Stay tuned for Monday. We'll talk more about media days and preview the upcoming season. We'll also talk a little bit of basketball. How did Scarlet and Gray do this weekend in the regionals? And, of course, Robert Smith coming up on Monday's show. You will want to hear his interview. What does he say about Ohio State's season prospects and the Big Ten and college football as a whole? So Robert Smith and some basketball and football talk coming up all on the Monday edition of Unscripted Ohio. Thank you for giving us a listen. Have a great weekend, everybody. Go Bucks.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.